Hello everyone, welcome to another edition of Meet Marshfield. Marshfield Community Television makes this time available for any group or person or business in town who would like to be on the show. Give us a call at the number that you see on the screen, 837-4384, and we'd be glad to look into it. And also, if you'd like to see any of our past shows, there have at least been 70 of them, just go on to Blip TV and you'll be able to see some of them. Today's program, we have on a special guest, and I think many of you met her before, and she is a library trustee for the Ventress Memorial Library, and I'd like to welcome to the show, Jean Christensen. Jean, thanks for coming. Now, Jean, that library's been there for quite a while. We go back to when, even before it was the first national store, I do believe, wasn't it?
It was indeed.
And how many years ago was that?
About 30 years ago, the library, I may be a year or two off, but about that moment ago that we bought the building and opened a new library.
Right. And so it's been there all that time, and of course a little wear and tear, and you've got an old building to begin with, I think. So, I mean, we're talking about that place being about maybe 50 years old at the moment?
Yes, I would think so.
Right.
And they weren't built to last a long time.
No, and that wasn't built as a library to begin with. It was thrown up as the first national store. A lot of people, I think, in town don't realize that it was the first national store when we were around at that time. So now, in the meantime, the library committee has been working on seeing if they can update the library and make it a more delightful place to be, more modern type of thing. And I know you went before the selectmen the other night, you and Ellen, and to talk about this. Can you give us a little update about what you have in mind?
Well, we've spent a lot of time working on plans. I've been a trustee for 11 years, and when I came on board, the trustees were already thinking about the need, and we knew very well that one of our biggest lacks is in the children's department, and we knew that we needed space for children, more space. So we did an assessment of where we were, and then we talked to the selectmen, and they said, time to get serious about this. Appointed a committee. That committee was appointed 6.5 years ago, and there were 7 of us. There are now 2 left. In 7 years, things change. They change jobs, family situations change, and so we've lost a lot of people who've contributed very heavily to this.
Who are the only 2 left? You and
Bill Last.
Bill Last, okay.
Right, there were 2 left. I'm the only trustee that was appointed to the building committee, so I've been a liaison with the committee, and it happens I'm also an active member of the Friends, so that I've been able to be a liaison there too. Our first effort, the selectmen gave us a list of instructions, and we have followed them. They said, look into this, and you need to hire help, an architectural firm, and we did. We were about to do that. We went out for bid, and we interviewed a number of firms, and we're about to make our selection when we got word that the laws in the state of Massachusetts had changed, and that before you did that, before you did any project like that, you had to have a project manager, which we did not have. So we had to put aside what we'd done and then do the whole search for a project manager, go out for bid, and we did eventually hire a project manager who is still with us. Then we went back out and went through the review process again and hired the firm that has been with us, Design in Partnership of Cambridge. And they've been with us through the process. And it's been a learning process for all of us on the committee. It was a long learning process. We were tutored in what works in libraries, what you need. We went to look at new additions and new libraries in the area, and learned a lot, and had a lot of things we knew we had to tackle right away, one of which was, where is it going to go? If we're going to come to the people in Marshfield and say, we're planning a lovely new library for you, where do you want it? We did a questionnaire, And I believe it was several hundred people responded to the questionnaire. And the one thing I remember about this was the one thing that we were told by 97% of those who answered was, stay in the center of Marshfield.
It is a good spot. I mean, it's right there in the center of everything.
Yeah, and Marshfield, as you know, is more than 10 miles long. We're not all that wide, but it's a good distance. If you want, I go down to the Fairview restaurant from where I live in North Marshfield, it's 10 miles. And so going to the library is only 5. So that is a good, and we were very aware of that at the time. So what we did was, of course, we looked at all town-owned land, and we looked at some parcels that were not town-owned land that were in the center of town, and we finally came to the conclusion that the best place to do was to stay where we were. One of the alternatives we looked at was building the new library in front where the parking was. This is before the playground. And then when that was built, we could move the books over and tear down what we have here, and the parking lot would go there. But things change over time, and now there's a wonderful playground there. And
plus, wouldn't it, the library wouldn't have been open for a year, would it?
Yes, we would. The library, as it exists now, would have stayed operational while the new library was being built on the parking lot.
Yeah.
There would have been a parking lot issue, but we thought that. But in the end, that just wasn't feasible. One of the other big issues you have to confront is you going 1 story, 2 stories. One thing I didn't say, and I should have said, right from the get-go, we said we're going after state money because the state has a program, and the application process is only about every 5 to 6 years. Just as we started was the last application form, which of course we were not ready for. So we knew we were going to go after state money, and we worked with the state very closely because they certainly have guidelines. They want to help the local communities, but they have a lot of experience. And so with our architectural firm, our project manager, and our staff, particularly Eleanor Baldy, who is the director of the library, we worked with people, and 2-story or not 2-story was an issue. One of the things that was a problem, potential problem with the Ventures, is we were built on a land that was boggy and clay. It used to be, I don't know if it was a turkey farm or a pheasant farm or something before it became a supermarket area. And we didn't know whether the land would sustain 2 acres. People sometimes forget the books are extremely heavy, and so you need a stronger support than you do in the average building. It turns out that it would have been all right. However, we decided for a number of reasons that 1 story probably was the way to go. And the reason and the concern for 2 stories is very important for librarians to have sightline. And if you go into the Ventures Library now and you notice there's the circulation desk, and then sort of opposite it is the reference desk. That gives the librarians the opportunity to be able to look and see what's going on in the entire place. Now, with 18,000 square feet, not all of which is out there because some of it's in the back where we do work, it works. But if you're getting larger, and at the time we started, the state guidelines did projections, population projections for Marshfield, and said we were going to need 40,000 square foot library because we were going to be, you have to plan for 20 years if you're going to get state money. And we said, we don't need 40,000. We really don't think we need that. And it came down to the proposal that we have now is about little over 31,000 square feet.
Let's talk a minute about that. The state will perhaps pay almost half of the cost.
Actually, this time they are going to pay, or will pay, up to 56% of the eligible costs. And our project, as it's now configured, comes out to 10,000. 10
million.
I'm sorry, yes, I say that before.
It'd be nice to have
you know where I am financially.
Yes.
10,900,000, of which 10,100,000 is eligible. What's not eligible is the outside landscaping, the parking, or any of the furniture.
Right.
So it's possible to get 56% of that $10,100,000. Also, for green design, you get more credit and get a little bit more percentage.
Okay, now in order for the people of Marshfield to get this, they would have to go to vote for it. Explain that process a bit.
Yes, they will need
And we
have to
have
go
about
to
2 or 3 minutes before we need to move on.
Okay, quickly. The application is going into the state of to the state on the 27th of this month. I understand, we said the other day 35, but I think 2 have withdrawn, 2 communities. So we're talking about competing with 30-some different communities, different size communities with different requirements. The state will review all the applications, and the application that's going in, it's this thick. It's a very, very detailed piece of work that's been done. And they will tell the communities, make the announcement in July, whether people, what they have decided, and if you got the grant and how much.
Right.
So we will know that in July. We have 4 months in which to say the town supports and will go with it or not. So there is some talk about maybe extending that, but we feel that the 4 months is
right.
absolutely what we have to go with, which means that if we get the grant, we would then go into town meeting in October and ask for the money, which would be a debt exclusion, and would depend on whether the treasurer makes a decision based on interest rates, etc., about whether we would go for 20 years, 10 years, whatever, in the borrowing process. And they have worked out, and the other day, when we were the selectmen, Ellen gave some numbers.
Right.
However, those were old numbers, and they're better right now than what she said. And I'm a little at fault for trying to remember. A house that's assessed at almost $400,000 would pay something like maybe $70 a year for this, depending on the length of time.
So
etc.
we go to town meeting. Is that the final step?
Well, if we don't get the grant, then we roll up our sleeves and say, how do we help the people of Marshfield have a better facility?
Right.
And in some way or form, we will work on that with other groups, with other ideas. If we get the grant,
okay.
if we get the grant and the town meeting passes it, then we will be in line, and exactly when the whole thing will start, I can't tell you, because it takes a while, after sometimes up to a year before the actual, yes, it's going to happen, before anything starts.
Right. Okay. Well, there's a couple of pictures here I just want to do quickly because we have to kind of move on. These are available at the library, and you will be having all sorts of brochures and all coming along so that people can see exactly what you have in mind. So anybody in town, as time goes on, just go to the library, see the librarian, see Ellen, and see Jean, and they'll be gladly to talk to you about these. So anyway, I wish you good luck. I know you put in an awful lot of years on this, and I hope for your sake it comes to fruition.
Well, I hope for the town's sake that it does.
Absolutely, I know you do. Let's go to the second half of the show now, which is something that you were involved in on Veterans Day, when we had some things, some displays and some speeches given down at the library at that time. And I've already done 2 of the individuals. That was Chris Wood and Bill Dunn. And so I think we have a couple of pictures that we can show of the individuals, and then we'll go into a CD, because I've already done a show with the other 2 gentlemen, but I wanted to also put on the CD of you, so that the people, because you were talking about quite an interesting lady. So do we have any of the pictures we can put up quickly, and Jean and I can talk underneath them? This is Chris Woods. She is the reference library. She's the one that kind of headed up the ceremony back in November. And then we have a local historian, Bill Dunn, and he talked about Michael Corcoran's life at the time, which is quite fascinating, Civil War. And then we have Jean, who talked about the lady knew both the gray and the blue, a true story of one of your ancestors. And then we have Mark Schmidt from the Winslow House, and he talked about a very interesting espionage plot in World War II called Operation Mincemeat. And so that kind of sets the stage for the CD that we'd like to play of Jean, who wants to talk about her ancestors during the Civil War period. So why don't we go to the CD and see Jean Christensen.
I'm in absolute awe at what Bill knows. And as a matter of fact, I know some things about my family only because Bill found out about them for me. I grew up in Connecticut, and my grandmother lived with us, and she was born in Alabama. And I was interested in family, and I always thought that that was my mother's mother, that they were Southern. And indeed, my mother's father was from the South. He was born in 1860, so he, of course, was too young for the war. But my grandmother talked to us about things, and I did know that her father was in the Union Army. As a matter of fact, at one time, we were given a gun, a rifle, that supposedly he carried in the Union Army. And I'm sad to say that when our sons were older, they were very fascinated by it. My husband Jack had made a slight improvement. There was a little bit of damage, and he had fixed it. And the boys used to keep the gun in their closet. And sometime, somewhere, somebody walked off with it, so we don't have that little artifact anymore. But my grandmother, my great-grandmother, who I thought, as I said, was a Southern, was born in Ohio. And she had married a Confederate soldier who died, was killed in the war. And Bill told me he was killed at Pea Ridge in Arkansas.
Yep.
And she had 2 daughters. And she had been living, and I found this out because maybe 6, 7 years ago, I started getting interested in family history and started doing some genealogical research. So I found out a few things here and there. But she had lived in Missouri, and fled to Alabama because although you remember that Missouri was a free state, there was lots of tension during the war with the Dred Scott decision. And all. I actually lived in Missouri for a while too, when my husband was in the Air Force. And she fled to Alabama. I don't know where she was in Alabama. But anyway, my great-grandfather, the man that she eventually married, was in college in Iowa. He grew up in Illinois, and he was in college in Iowa when the war started. And he enrolled the war started in April, and he enrolled in the Union Army in July of that year. And Bill has told me, because he found it, that he was in the cavalry division. And I know that he got out of the Army, but I didn't know until after I had lived in Selma, Alabama, because my husband Jack was in the Air Force and was stationed in Selma, Alabama, back in the 1950s, that my great-grandfather was mustered out of the Union Army in Selma. Bill has told me that Selma was a very major industrial center for the Confederate Army. I didn't know that because when I was there, it was a small southern town. It was a difficult time to be there in the 50s for someone having grown up in the North. As I say, my grandmother grew up in Hayneville, Alabama, which is halfway between Montgomery and Selma. I did know she grew up in Hayneville, and she used to brag about the fact that Joe Louis, the boxer, was born there. But Selma never entered the picture until after we had lived there. And we did, my husband and I decided, I knew that in Hayneville, my great-grandfather, the one who'd been the Union soldier, was buried. And so he and we had one child at the time, and I was pregnant with number 2, went over to Selma, to Hayneville, and stopped at a little general store called the McDuffie store, and my ancestor was named McDuffie. My ancestors in that line were Scotch. And we went through a pecan orchard and found the grave. This great-grandfather of mine had been not only, after he got out, he stayed, obviously, in Alabama, eventually became a plantation owner. He also got his law degree. He became a probate judge. He was elected to Congress. And when I was doing some of the research, and I unfortunately was not very thorough at those days, and I didn't take copies, so I don't know, I can't cite the location. It said that John Van McDuffie was elected to Congress with the help of the Negroes. Because if you all remember, after the Civil War, for a time, the blacks did have the vote. Well, they lost the vote, and my grandfather was no longer elected to Congress. However, he maintained a very active political life. And I wonder at how this happened, and Bill has mentioned it to me too. It must have been something rather extraordinary that this woman, who was the widow of a Confederate soldier, but a Northerner herself, who eventually married a Union soldier living in the heart of the South, could do so and be successful. Because I'll tell you, living in Selma in the 1950s, the war wasn't over for a lot of people then. When we moved to town, we got, my name is Christensen, and my husband's an officer. We got an invitation to join the Ku Klux Klan. Somewhere, I think, among all the things that I have that invitation still. I wish I knew how to put my hands on it. The other thing is, when you came into Selma, outside, you know, when they say, welcome to whatever town, the Kiwanis welcomes you, there was a huge sign. It was a big saw with a blade, and it was all painted white with glitter. And it was the announcement of the welcoming from the Ku Klux Klan. And this was in the 1950s. And we lived in a big mansion that had been converted to smaller apartments for military during when we were there. And the woman that lived downstairs was a lovely lady, but she was a native. And she told me that we were extremely lucky to have come when we did, because the Klan had ridden through only about 2 weeks before we went to Selma. And things were in good shape because of that. Selma was a pretty little town. And, but I, you know, as I say, I didn't have any connection that I had an ancestor that had some activity there. There was one other thing that I'll tell you a little about, and my husband doesn't know this, but when we had our first son, I was in Connecticut, and I wanted to name him Craig. And my mother came into the hospital, I filled out the form, and she said, "What did you do?" And I said, "Well, I'm naming him Craig. We've talked about that. Jack doesn't care." She said, "You have misread the whole thing. He does care. He wants your son to be a junior." Fortunately, I hadn't turned it over, and so I was able to redo it and name our first son Jack Jr. But I said, if we ever have another son, and we did have 3 more, but if we ever have another son, he's going to be Craig. Well, would you know that Jack was stationed at Craig Air Force Base in Selma, Alabama, when we had our second son. It was not named after the Air Force Base, but that was one of those small coincidences. Bill has mentioned in his article that my great-grandmother's family can be traced back, and as far as I know, and I'm not a genealogist, but to the Rogers, who were here in Marshfield. We live on Union Street, which is near the North River, and the Rogers got land. There were 2 brothers. One came over in the Mayflower, the one I think I'm related to, and the other brother came over from Holland later. The one that I was related to never actually lived there. He eventually went down and was one of the founders of Eastham, Mass. But it was strange to find these connections that happen. Anyway, the whole thing with the war, and Bill has filled in a lot of the gaps about what happened, and I'm not a military person, so I defer to his knowledge and about it. But I just wonder how somebody could live successfully after being part of the opposition in the South. What I'd like to do is, for some reason, and I'm not a big Porter fan, but there's been a poem that I've been very, very fond of all my life. I wish all the sentiments in it were true. I unfortunately don't believe they are, but with your indulgence, I'd like to quickly read you the poem. It is The Blue and the Gray. It's by the flow of the inland river, whence the fleets of iron have fled, where the blades of brave grass quiver, asleep are the ranks of the dead. Under the sod and the dew, awaiting the judgment day, under the one, the blue, under the other, the gray. These in the robings of glory those in the gloom of defeat, all with a battle blood gory, in the dust of eternity meet. Under the sod and the dew, awaiting the judgment day, under the laurel, the blue, under the willow, the gray. From the silence of sorrowful hours, the desolate mourners go, lovingly laden with flowers, alike for the friend and the foe. Under the sod and the dew, awaiting the judgment day, under the roses, the blue, under the lilies, the gray. So with an equal splendor, the morning sun rays fall, with a touch impartially tender, on the blossoms blooming for all. Under the sod and the dew, awaiting the judgment day, bordered with gold the blue, mellowed with gold the gray. So when the summer calleth, on the forest and field of grain, with an equal murmur falleth the cooling drip of rain. Under the sod and the dew, awaiting the judgment day, wet with the rain the blue, wet with the rain the gray. Sadly, but not with upbraiding, the generous deed was done. In the storm of the years that are fading, no braver battle was won. Under the sod and the dew, awaiting the judgment day, under the blossoms the blue, under the garlands the gray. No more shall the war cry sever, or the winding rivers be red. They banish our anger forever when they laurel the graves of our dead. Under the sod and the dew, awaiting the judgment day, love and tears for the blue, tears and love for the gray. You know, what I would like to say, although I knew and I saw some of the bitterness or the still animosity in the South, we were welcomed. And when we went over to that gravesite to see where my great-grandparents were buried, before we could leave and go back through the pecan orchard and get to our car, another car had pulled up in the middle of nowhere. And my husband said to me, uh-oh, someone's checking us out. And we got down to the car, and two women came up and said, "You must be Miss Maud's children." We had, of course, Connecticut license plates at that time. And I said, well, yes, she was my grandmother. Well, these were the children of her two half-sisters who welcomed us and with open arms and were so friendly that my husband Jack, who was a real Yankee, couldn't take it. It was just a little bit too much for him. But the children, my grandmother had a son who fought in World War I. She had grandchildren who fought in World War II. Matter of fact, one of my cousins, who's still alive in her late 80s, was in the military. So out of the combination of the South and the North, Americans who fought in battles after the war. And for me, a lot, I'm hoping that I'm going to learn even more about the life, and I'm going to rely on Bill to tell me. But I really want to say thank you to him for filling me in on these things, because I did know a little, and now I know a lot more. Thank you.